All right, so welcome to our first online lab. This is not ideal. The labs are meant to be hands-on activities, and I think it's going to be particularly complicated to do some of the Excel problems without one-on-one help. So definitely make use of the office hours, and hopefully we can use screen sharing and things like that to figure this out together. So some of the skills that we're going to continue building on are your ability to make scatter plots. And we're going to add a new skill, which is how do we fit a model, a mathematical model, to make understandings about the world. And so to figure out why this matters, let's go back to the scientific method that I showed you guys on the very first day of class, right? So here's a flow chart that shows you the steps in the scientific method. Usually we begin with some observation. We notice something interesting. So if you remember on the first day of class, it was a weird gall that I saw on an oak leaf. That observation leads you to ask a question. To answer the question, we have to make hypotheses that imply experiments and predictions, right? And remember, we talked about that oak leaf, that different hypotheses led to very different experiments and predictions. Then we do that test and we find out, were we right or were we wrong? And often it's the most interesting when we're wrong, because then we have to actually learn something and make a new hypothesis. And so one of the reasons why I do a lot of mathematical modeling is because models are a really powerful way to formalize your hypotheses and be very clear about all your assumptions, right? So often a hypothesis might be, oh, if I grow this plant in full sun or the shade, maybe it will be a different size, probably smaller in the shade, depending on the species. But a mathematical model can say, instead of I expect this plant to be smaller, I expect it to be 20% smaller or 30% smaller. It allows you to be very specific. And it means that you have a much clearer understanding of the world if that mathematical model is working. So what I want to start with today is an observation that populations can grow exponentially. Right? So here's a quote from Darwin in The Origin of Species, and he says, "There is no exception to the rule that every organic being increases at so high a rate that if it wasn't destroyed by something, the Earth would soon be covered by the progeny of a single pair." I love this Victorian style of talking, but what he means by destroyed is, if they weren't killed by predators or die of starvation or something like that. And he goes on to say, well, this famous old dude Linnaeus had calculated that if an annual plant produced only 2 seeds and then dies, right? And he sort of points out that there isn't a plant that does this. Most plants make thousands or hundreds of seeds. But if there was such a species of plant that only made 2 seeds and then died, and then next year their seedlings produced 2, and so on, in 20 years there would be 1 million plants. And actually this is really relevant in the context of COVID-19 right now. You may have heard people talking about this value R0 with respect to how the virus spreads. That's basically the idea. So the R0 of this hypothetical plant is 2. And I think for COVID it's around 2.5. And so here are Linnaeus' calculations. We can see that in 20 years there's more than 1 million plants. And you can see that it's just exploding exponentially. And in fact, we can carry this forward. And what we get is a number that I don't even know how to tell you. And by 63 years, Excel won't even calculate it. It's basically infinity. And so we could ask a question, do populations grow exponentially? Now, if we were in the same room together, I would actually ask you to tell me, but you might say out loud to yourself, do you think populations grow exponentially? And the answer is sort of obviously no, they don't. So how do they grow? Well, in fact, if we take a look more carefully, not just at the rate that they can increase, but actually track population growth over time and make a graph, I should note that you should think about what's wrong with this graph and where Noel should be taking points off of me for making this graph. But populations don't seem to grow forever. Even though they're capable of it, they don't. They tend to follow this sort of S-shaped curve called a logistic curve. And this logistic curve has a couple of interesting phases. In phase 1, the population growth rate is accelerating and it appears to be getting faster and faster. It's almost exponential. Phase 2 is where it switches directions. And if any of you are calculus nerds, this is the inflection point of the curve. It's where it actually switches from increasing to decreasing. And then phase 3 is where it settles into zero population growth rate and reaches that stable maximum where it's going to stay. And what can be really interesting is to make what's called a rate level plot of this, where we take actually the derivative of the function and plot it against the independent variable. So it's dn dt as a function of n, and what we see is the phases are basically defined by increasing growth rate, zero growth rate, and then a decreasing growth rate. And you can kind of see that, if everybody's dead, obviously the growth rate is going to be 0. and at carrying capacity, the growth rate is 0, and that the maximum population growth rate is right here at the inflection point before it starts slowing down. And so the feature of a logistic curve is that it's basically described by two numbers, or what we call parameters. One of those numbers is the carrying capacity, which we often represent as K in ecology. It's just the maximum number of individuals that you can have in a particular place. And R is sometimes called the intrinsic rate of increase. It's this ability, it's the fastest possible growth rate if there was no competition, no enemy attack, no mutualism helping the plants out. What is the fastest possible growth rate that a plant could have in the complete absence of interactions? And that's R. And then if we have those two things, we can actually express this growth as a difference equation here. So the way you look at this is you've got what is the population 1 year in the future. To predict that, we just need to know what is its population size today at the current time, NT. You can see we put that in 3 places. And then we just need to know a number for R and a number for K. In this case, because I made these data up, I set R to 0.25 and K to 100. So you can see that K is 100 here. And we can calculate that it's 0.25 using particular methods that we'll talk about for this lab. And so it's worth thinking about what can define these, what biology is captured by R and K, right? So the intrinsic rate of growth can be determined by things like birth rates, how many seeds can a plant make, right? Plants vary in the number of seeds they can make. Death rates, it might be determined by dispersal if you have individuals coming in from far away by dispersal. The carrying capacity is determined by things like resource levels, so how much light there is, how much nutrients. And it might also be determined by interactions, right? Remember we talked about jack pine, and that jack pine is probably reduced to a 0 or negative population size where there are pine beetles. So an attack from an enemy might depress this and reduce the carrying capacity. Okay, so how do we estimate R and K? Well, one of the ways to do it is by thinking about what's called the geometric rate of increase. And that sounds fancy, but it's basically this equation. So if we know, so let's say we've measured these data, right? We actually watched these populations grow and we know that this is the way that they grew. So that means we know every NT plus 1 and every NT, right? So if we want to do this for right here, we just have to rearrange this equation to calculate lambda, right? So the first lambda is undefined because we don't know what happened before. But the second lambda, we basically just rearrange this equation and we find that 1.25 divided by 1 gives us back 1.25. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, I wish I was in the room with you, but you can pause the video and rewind if you need to. Right? So just by rearranging this equation, we get that lambda equals NT plus 1 divided by NT. Right? So if we know 1.55, we divide that by 1.25. You can do this with your calculator, and you'll get 1.24. And we can keep going down like that. 1.94 divided by 1.55. That gives us 1.25 and some change. And we go all the way down. And what we see is that it's gradually decreasing until it gets to 1. And hopefully it should make sense why at the carrying capacity, which we know is 100, lambda should be equal to 1, because if we divide this by this, but this is now never changing, it just hits 100 and stays there forever, we just get 100 divided by 100 over and over and over again, right? And so it stops at 1. And this is useful because we can then fit a line to this. So we can fit a straight line to this using Excel. So you right-click on the data and click Add Trend Line and then Show Equation, and you'll get something like this. Again, you might want to think about where Noel might take points off for this graph that I've made. And then what we can learn is two things. So when x is equal to, when y is equal to 1, we get the carrying capacity. So put a 1 in here and rearrange and solve for x. That's really simple. If you do that, what you'll find is that k is equal to 100. Cool. So k is defined by the value where lambda is equal to 1. R is defined by the y-intercept. So to find that, we just set x equal to 0, and we see pretty clearly that it's 1.2589. But this is in an exponential scale, so we have to use the natural logarithm to actually convert it. So you take the natural log of the y-intercept, which is here, and you get 0.23. Now this is the simplest method to estimate population growth. We got an estimate of R 0.23, K equals 100. But it's not perfect. So remember, I made these data up. So we know that R is 0.25. So we got pretty close, but we didn't get the right answer. There are more sophisticated ways of doing this, but it's beyond a freshman class. This is just a straight line and rearranging it to get some basic answers. Okay, so now let's say we know that we estimated that R was 0.23 and K was 100. How do we use this equation, right? What we want to do is we want to estimate what's going to happen. What's the n at t equals 4, right? So we know that R is 0.23. We estimated that. We estimated K to be 100, and we know that n at time 3 was 1.48. So that's easy, right? We've got n3 plus R times n3 times 1 minus n3 over 100. Well, we know n3, we know R, we know K. So we just sub in 1.48 for n3, and we get 1.8. Whoops. Yeah, and we get 1.8. It's just that simple. I think a lot of times students want this to be more complicated than it is, but you might consider just double checking, maybe pause the video and figure out, how did I get this number for n5? Right? So we would just put 1.8, 1.8, 1.8, and that should give you 2.19. You might want to do these calculations because it'll help you out in the end. Okay, so here's a fun example that I thought might be worth just looking at. So here is Purdue enrollment from the year 1874, which was the year that the school opened, with 65 students. Imagine the campus with only 65 students. Up to 2014, which was the most recent data that I had available, where the population was 38,788. What you can see is that the Purdue population is growing according to something that looks an awful lot like a logistic curve going back to 1874. Again, think about where Noel would take points off from my lecture here. So what we can do is we can estimate lambda for Purdue, right? So it's undefined for the first year of Purdue because there wasn't a Purdue before 1874. That's fine. How do we get it for this next cell here? Well, that's easy. It's 66 divided by 65, which gives us a number that's pretty close to 1, right? By the next year, it was 140 divided by 66, gives us 2 and change, and so on. If you know about Excel, right, once you've entered this formula, you can just drag it down. That's really easy. These little ellipses, there's lots more data. I'm not going to show you the 100 some odd rows. All right, so now we have lambda. What do we do to estimate R and K for Purdue? Well, all we have to do is plot lambda versus time and then get the straight line like I showed you. So here's that straight line. You can see that real data is a little bit more messy than the data that I made up for the previous example, but we get this equation that y, well, I'm not going to read it to you, but this is the equation. So remember, we need to figure out two things. We set y equal to 1, rearrange and solve for x. That will give us k. And then the y-intercept, which is just 1.089, gives us r, but don't forget that we have to take the natural log of 1.089, which gives us 0.85 for the intrinsic rate of increase. And K is 44,500 students at Purdue. So then what we can do is we can say, all right, well, what's the predicted enrollment? Well, we need to have something to start with. Otherwise, we can't do the calculation. So all we need to do is to figure this out is use R and K just like we did before. So we estimated that R is 0.085. We estimated K is 44,500. So if we want to know what's going on here, we just put 65, 65, 65, do these calculations. Make sure you don't mix up the brackets. And we find 69. We could do then with 66. 66 here, 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 do the calculation. We're going to get 73. And then if you've got this entered in Excel, you just drag it down. Sorry that it moved over like that. And what we see is we can now predict population growth rate. So there you go, predicting population growth rate. So you can see that, like I told you before, this geometric method is not the most sophisticated method. So you can see that it's a bit over predicting the population size of Purdue. And I think that's mainly because it does a pretty good job of predicting K, but as we saw, the geometric method doesn't predict R very well. But we can cast this forward, right? So now we have a model of this. We could say, well, what do we predict going forward to the year 2050 or something like that, right? So we can do this. And we can, now that we have a model, we can go here. So you can see I added an X for 2016, which was the best data I could find. But you can see that we predict that Purdue is going to reach its carrying capacity by the year 2042. So I don't think that's 25 years anymore. These are old slides. But by the year 2042, Purdue is going to basically run out of classrooms, run out of residences, whatever else you might think is limiting the carrying capacity of Purdue. So you might think about what is limiting the carrying capacity of Purdue, right? Maybe it's tuition. Maybe it's the number of beds or the number of classrooms or something like that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at population dynamics of the smallest angiosperm in the world, duckweed, which is Lemna minor. It makes the smallest flowers. They're adorable, teeny tiny little flowers. It has basically a leaf that's called a thallus, and it has these roots that hang down. And here's a picture of one. They're very, very teeny tiny. They're like little tiny lily pads. And we have an observation, right? Plants have the capacity for exponential population growth, but they don't seem to grow exponentially. And we're going to start to ask what limits population growth, right? Our hypothesis is going to be that resource availability is going to limit population growth. And in particular, we suggest that light is important for photosynthesis, and so therefore light is probably an important limiting factor for plant population growth. So this is sort of the pre-lab lecture module for this lab. The next video, I'm going to actually sort of show you what this would have looked like if we could have done it in person. So I just wanted to add a quick clip at the end of this because I meant to draw your attention to this funny spike down and up and then back down again that happened around 75, 80 years after Purdue was founded. Does anyone know what might have actually caused this? Yeah, these were the World Wars. And so remember, when I fit the model to this, we get this kind of line that's doing really good until World War II. And so I think that's actually why the model failed in this case, is because we have this sort of decline that then is different from the initial trajectory of Purdue. If the World Wars hadn't happened, we would probably expect Purdue to have followed this trajectory. So I just thought that was an interesting bit about how the real world can often depart from the simplicity of models, right? The model doesn't account for this funny drop and then increase. Okay, now let's get on with the duckweed.